So, today we're going to dive into a legal case that really makes you think. It asks a pretty fundamental question. What happens when the very rules designed to make sure courts are fair are the same rules being ignored? We're going to explore the anatomy of an appeal, where the process itself is basically on trial. It's easy to get lost in all the legal jargon and think of procedure as just a bunch of technicalities, right? But you've got to remember this. Procedure isn't some footnote. It is the actual framework, the architecture, that's supposed to guarantee every case gets a fair hearing. And when that framework starts to crack, the whole structure is at risk. Okay, so this whole story really kicks off with a core principle of American governance. Look at this disclosure letter to the U.S. Attorney. It makes it crystal clear that the official policy is to fix misconduct and be transparent. And we're about to see a case where that very principle was seriously put to the test. All right, here's how we're going to walk through this. First, we'll look at the initial fight for transparency. Then we'll get into the super critical question of jurisdiction. After that, we'll examine the errors that were allegedly made in the review process. And finally, we'll get to the final appeal itself. So let's start at the beginning. Our case study kicks off with what seems like a totally reasonable request for public information. It all started with one citizen, a guy named Michael Miller in Lancaster County. He used Pennsylvania's public records law to ask for access to some documents from the 2022 election. Pretty simple act, civic engagement, right? So what did he ask for specifically? Well, it was 3 categories of things. The actual physical mail-in ballots and their envelopes, the digital images of those same ballots, and something called cast vote records, or CVRs, which are basically the digital tallies from the voting machines. But this is where things took a turn. His request was met with a lot of resistance. State agencies put these really heavy restrictions on his access. They said he could only inspect some records and only under supervision, and he couldn't even copy them. Miller argued this was way more than just a records dispute. He claimed it was actually a coordinated scheme to stop the public from being able to scrutinize and discuss what the government was doing. And he took that argument to federal court, framing it as a constitutional challenge. And this is the exact moment the case pivots. It goes from a fight over public records to a really fundamental question about judicial power itself. So before any court can even start to look at the facts of a case, it has to have something called subject matter jurisdiction. Just think of it like the court's basic authority, its ticket to even be in the game. If a court doesn't have it, it is completely powerless to make any kind of ruling, period. And this isn't some minor, obscure rule. The Supreme Court has been absolutely emphatic on this point. In this huge case, Steele Co., the court said this rule is inflexible and without exception. You don't get to the merits, you don't use any other powers, you do nothing until you first confirm you have jurisdiction. So the process is supposed to be a simple 2-step. Step 1, a court must confirm it has the power to hear the case. Step 2, only after that can it decide whether it wants to use that power, like, say, choosing to abstain, to step aside. But in Miller's case, the whole argument is that the district court flipped this completely backward. It decided to abstain while at the same time saying it didn't even have jurisdiction to begin with. So how did the court justify stepping aside? It claimed that Miller's federal issues were already being handled in a parallel state case. But the petition argues this whole idea was a mirage. Why? Because the actual state court record shows that it explicitly refused to even consider the federal constitutional claims. And according to precedent, for cases to be parallel, the same issues have to actually be getting decided. Without a real parallel case, the federal court's duty to hear the claims was, well, mandatory. Okay, so that whole jurisdictional puzzle leads us right to the core of the appeal, the specific procedural breakdowns that are alleged to have happened inside the court itself. This slide really lays out the next big issue perfectly. See, when someone files specific objections to a magistrate judge's report, the law demands that the district judge has to conduct what's called a de novo review. That means a fresh, totally independent analysis. But instead of taking that fresh look, the court allegedly used a much, much lower clear error standard. Think of it like this. It's the difference between redoing the math problem yourself versus just kind of glancing at the answer to see if it looks about right. So how did it justify doing this? Well, it was a pretty simple move, really. It just relabeled Miller's very detailed, very specific objections as general. And the petition argues this wasn't just a simple choice of words. It was a move that effectively denied a litigant's statutory right to a thorough review by a senior federal judge. And here's the legal hammer. According to the Third Circuit's own precedent, this kind of failure isn't some minor oopsie that you can just brush off as harmless error. No, it's what's called a structural error. That means it invalidates the entire review process because the fundamental architecture of how the courts are supposed to work was compromised. It's an error so deep that it can't be fixed later on. And the petition points out that this wasn't the only procedural safeguard that was allegedly bypassed. For one, because Miller was representing himself, what's called pro se, his legal filings were entitled to be read more leniently. And also, as a general rule, a court isn't supposed to permanently dismiss a case without first giving the person a chance to fix their complaint, or at the very least, explaining why it would be impossible to fix.
So you take all of these alleged procedural breakdowns and they all build up to one thing, a final challenge to the entire process. And this right here, this is the document that brought everything to a head. It's the final judgment from the Third Circuit Court of Appeals, and it affirmed the lower court's dismissal. In response to this, Miller filed what's called a petition for rehearing, basically asking the entire court to take another look.
And that petition really boiled the entire case down to these 4 critical questions it called of exceptional importance. Can a court just decide to abstain without even establishing jurisdiction first? Can it deny someone a federal hearing based on a phantom parallel case that doesn't really exist? Is failing to do a mandatory de novo review a fatal, reversible error? And can a court clerk just unilaterally stop a case from being fully briefed and argued? And if you can believe it, even after the final appeal was filed, the petition points to one last structural problem. The law is really clear on this. Once an appeal is filed, the lower court loses its power, its jurisdiction over the case. But in this situation, the district court allegedly kept taking actions, adding things to the case record to support a whole separate motion for sanctions. This continued use of power is framed as a way to deter people from pursuing transparency in the first place. And that really leaves us with this final thought. You see, this case was never just about getting access to some election records. It raises a much, much deeper question for our entire justice system. When the procedural safeguards, the very architecture that's designed to ensure a fair hearing, are bypassed, can the final decision, no matter what it is, truly be called justice?